Now, what shall we learn from these messages? From these passages? 3 things. Number 1, we should gain wonder in worship because we gain a fresh grasp of how God has put the Bible together. We should gain wonder in worship as we gain a fresh grasp of how God has put the Bible together. I sometimes play with my students at Trinity in this respect. We've all had the experience of reading some passage in the New Testament that quotes the Old, and we look in the margin to see where the Old Testament text comes from. Then we look it up, and then we read the Old Testament text in its context, and we think, good grief, what did the New Testament writer quote that for? It seems terribly ripped out of context. Well, I'm sure somebody knows about it somewhere, and then we press on with our devotions and don't give it another thought. But deep down, there is a niggly suspicion in the back of our minds that says, you know, this may be all very clever, and we can hide it under categories like typology. But God, you know, I don't want to be critical, but God could have said things a little more clearly, don't you think? So I suggest to my students that God could have written Isaiah 53 a little differently. Like this. And it shall come to pass in those days, says the Lord, just over 700 years before Christ, that there shall be a Roman emperor by the name of Caesar Augustus. Footnote. I know the Roman Empire doesn't exist. You're still under the miserable Assyrians. After the Assyrians come the Babylonians. After the Babylonians come the Medo-Persians. After the Medo-Persians come the Greeks. And after the Greeks come the Romans. I know that at the moment there is no Rome. They're just a bunch of little villages on the left bank of the Tiber. But they are going to coalesce and become the city of Rome. And they are going to capture all of Italy, and they're eventually going to rule the Mediterranean world. And at the time that I'm talking of, there will be a king, in effect, who will be called the emperor. His family name will be Caesar, and Caesar will become the title, roughly like king. That Caesar is Augustus. That's what I'm talking about. Back to the text. And this emperor, called Caesar Augustus, will pass a decree that the entire Roman world should be taxed. And in consequence, there will be a man by the name of Joseph, engaged to a charming young woman by the name of Mary, who will be forced to go back to Bethlehem, his natal place, to enroll for taxation. Everybody's happy so far. And then eventually you go on with detailed descriptions of everything. You mentioned Pontius Pilate, and you describe how he's going to have to wash his hands in water when he finds Jesus guilty but doesn't want to pronounce him guilty, and then eventually does pronounce him guilty, and the vision of his wife. All the details, they're all there. They're all there, okay? Now, wouldn't that be a great prophecy? There would be no doubt then, especially if you could prove that we had manuscripts back from Isaiah's day. God could have arranged that. But, I mean, if we don't have all the way back, I mean, we have them from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have Isaiah scrolls 150, 200 years before Christ. Good enough, I mean, considering the detail now given regarding Jesus. Wouldn't that be convincing prophecy? Why doesn't God make things clear, for goodness sake? Well, for a start, there would have been an awful lot of babies around by the name of Joseph and Mary. The population of Nazareth could have been overwhelming, as everybody wanted to be there when the time came to have to head back for Bethlehem. And if Pontius Pilate ever read this manuscript before Jesus came before him, he'd be in one miserable place. I will not wash my hands. I will not wash my hands. But somebody power's dragging me to wash my hands. Does he wash his hands or does he not? If he doesn't wash his hands, then of course he has utterly destroyed the prophecies of God. And if he does wash his hands when he doesn't really want to, has he been reduced to a mere robot? You think you've got problems with God's sovereignty and human responsibility now. We had a few more prophecies like the way I'd write Isaiah 53, you'd have much bigger problems, I assure you. Do you see? But it's more than that. God has given us such stellar patterns in institutions, in people, in kingdoms, in rights. Such stellar patterns which blind and harden and deafen those who are offended by the truth, but which are seen with clarity for what they are in the fullness of time as we look back and marvel at God's intricate design to bring us with such clarity to King Jesus. And you cannot study these things for very long before you bow and worship. God interweaving these various patterns together across the centuries, from Genesis right through to the end of the Old Covenant Scriptures and into the New Covenant. And parables are a constituent part of that in the fullness of time self-disclosure. So we should gain wonder in worship where there is a fresh grasp of how God has put the Bible together, culminating in the gospel of God.